excited about this series that we're going to be doing. A little bit about me and then our panelists, and then I'll give you the kind of lay of the land for the series. I'm Sophie. I manage client success here at SingleSprout. Before that, I managed account management. I've been here for about 4 years. DEI is very near and dear to my heart, and it's something that I tend to consult and talk with a lot of our clients about, and also help on the internal side within SingleSprout. A little bit about Jes. She actually also advises SingleSprout and our DEI. She's co-founder and fractional head of DEI at the Rise Journey. She operationalizes, that was a mouthful, DEVA, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and accessibility strategies as part of building foundational and sustainable organizational culture. She's been named to Mogul's top leaders in DEIB list in 2021 and 2022. We're also joined today by Ayanna Kelly. She's an advisor and speaker at the Rise Journey, and HR strategy and organizational culture consultancy, and bridges the gap between DEI and organizational development. She's the DEI Product Manager of Rise's recently launched program, Rise with OPHR, which I'm sure we'll be referencing later in this conversation. She also uses her lived experiences as an Afro-Latina mother and disabled veteran to breathe life into her HR, DEVA, and advocacy work. So welcome to both of you. Thanks so much for being on. Before we dive into everything, just a little bit more about this overall series. The first part of this series, which is today, is really talking about DEI Foundations and getting it into recruitment. So we're not really going to be talking about the interview process or retention. Those are going to be the second and third subjects. We're talking about, like, how do you attract talent? What does that look like? How do you look at a resume, and how do you be inclusive as part of it? And how do you really, like, infuse your company with that mindset moving forward? And so we do have a 1-pager, which is actually maybe 4 or 5 pages that we're going to be sending out later, with really actionable steps and really small little, like, habit forming things that you can do that are really accessible to anyone, even if you already have a DEI strategy or if you don't. So with that, please feel free to drop questions in the chat. We are going to be doing a Q&A at the end for about 10 or 15 minutes, but please feel free to ask any questions in the chat and we'll come back to them. And now, just to start, Jes, what would you say are the foundations of DEVA?
So sorry, trying to get my headphones to work, not working. I take off from Kimberly Crenshaw's kind of thoughts around diversity and inclusion, and I use the term DEVA of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and accessibility. And I'm going to read off my notes here. So diversity, when you think about diversity, it's numbers based, it's identifiers, it's metrics. There's this many Black people in the room, there's this many people with a disability, so on and so forth. It's the categorization. When you think of equity, you're thinking of opportunities, power. Are resources accessible? Are we meeting people where they're at? Talking about privilege gaps, really making sure, I'm sure a lot of you have seen, there's a cartoon where you have 3 people standing on different size boxes. Equality is they all have the same size box. Equity is different size boxes to meet them. It's not a perfect metaphor, but it's a good one. Inclusion is that felt impact. Everybody, I'm sure, has an experience where you've walked into a room and if you feel included or not, and you feel it. You may not know it, but you feel it immediately. My head immediately goes to, like, middle school gym class where I did not feel included. Belonging, another kind of felt piece, but really, like, you can engage in your fullest. You can speak up when maybe you wouldn't necessarily speak up before because you're not going to get judged or pushed out because of that. There's an acceptance, there's a sense of security within that acceptance. And then accessibility is really personal to me. I myself identify as disabled with depression and anxiety. I've been on medication for many years. Disability, accessibility are often intertwined. They don't have to be, nor should they be. For me, accessibility is about, in the workplace, having everybody do their best work. And even with the three of us on our faces on screen here, we all do work differently. We might need different tools, different resources, different support. That's not about disability, that's about accessibility and making sure that we can all contribute our best, regardless of what we may need. When the disability piece comes in, you talk about accommodations and some of those other pieces, which we will talk about today. And I have a little kind of visual for that, again, going on that middle school dance, diversity. Imagine you go up, hopefully you had experience with some sort of dance or gathering at your school. Diversity is the people in the room. Like I said, you're counting, you have this many kids, you have this many adults, you have this many of this or that. Equity, you think about, how did everybody get to that school dance? Was there a school bus? Was some parents picking up other kids? Did some kids ride their bike? Did everybody have equitable access to get to that dance without a struggle, without feeling othered, without being on the outside? When you get to that dance and you open those doors, those my cafeteria doors, you look inside, you see your group. And not only are they like, hey, hi, but they're like, come here, come dance. And whether you dance the robot or you don't dance at all, you're included. That's part of that inclusion piece. And the belonging is built into that. You can do whatever you want and nobody's gonna be like, oh my God, what are they doing? They might even encourage you to dance as funky as you want or not dance as funky as you want. And then that accessibility, how can everybody enjoy that dance to the best of their ability? Maybe some people have specific food requirements, and so there's a separate table for different food. Maybe somebody has noise sensitivity and they have noise canceling headphones, but they can still be there and participate. So really thinking about it in an ecosystem rather than all of these kind of disparate pieces. And so for me, DEI is the foundation of everything in a workplace. In this case, obviously we're talking about recruitment, but that's kind of my little visual for that.
It's a great analogy. And I think we've all been in those situations where we felt uncomfortable or where there wasn't diversity or where it wasn't accessible for some people. And I think it's really interesting because generally we talk about DEI, but I do think that sense of belonging and accessibility are like much newer concepts that I haven't really heard before. And I think there's a big movement that I'm seeing and listening to in different podcasts surrounding disabilities and what does that look like, and that not being a seen aspect of the conversation. Maybe you need to dig a little bit deeper and be more mindful. So moving on, I feel as if we're talking about DEI diversity, getting more candidates into the pipeline from different backgrounds. Let's talk about tokenism. How do you address that? How do you think about it? And how do you push back against that, Ayanna?
Yeah, this is something that's super personal to me because I've been that token before. And I would say, first of all, let's define it. Tokenism is when you use that one marginalized person or other person in the group to represent everyone and always be the spokesperson for that community. That is unrealistic and really should not be the expectation for that one person to carry your culture on their shoulders. No one wants to be the token, especially in an environment where they're not necessarily supported or there aren't efforts in place to actually retain these people. And also you don't want to have false advertising, right? Like you say, oh, we have women of color on our board, but there's only one person and there's not necessarily an ecosystem to support them. And the rest of your organization is homogenous, right? We want true representation. So if that really does mean that you don't have people of color on a particular board, be open about it, be upfront and indicate that that is an effort that you're trying to address instead of trying to put someone as the face of it. How do you avoid it? Don't go seeking for a specific person in a specific role just for that purpose. Look at their skills, are they a culture fit, right? Like look at all of the other things that you're trying to recruit for. The way to do that, we'll obviously talk about later in this conversation, but diversify where those people are coming from. There's a lot of different ways to be able to do that. I would just say upfront, don't put that one person in a position where they have to represent the entire community all the time, because it is a burden. We typically, I'm speaking for myself as a woman of color, we feel an obligation to represent our different backgrounds and our identities, and it can be incredibly frustrating when we're trying to represent in a specific way, but we're not necessarily being supported, or it's not true to who we are as an organization.
Yeah, I loved what you said at first. You said carry culture on the shoulders. So you were the one holding all of that together. And I think that's especially important. And thank you for bringing up those points. I think a lot happened in 2020 and everyone rushed to put a lot of burden on people instead of saying, do you feel comfortable? What does this look like? Do you have the support you need to be able to accomplish this? And great if you do, but not everyone does. And that kind of leads us nicely to the next point, which is who is responsible for DEBA in an organization?
I just want to jump in really quickly. The other piece of that I always find, again, I go very visual, is, not all Black people are a monolith. Not all women are a monolith. So Ayanna may represent an identity, or in her case, many identities that fall into that diversity box, but she's not the spokesperson. She's not the only person. And I think in the workplace, it's very natural for us to be like, oh, Sophie, you're the glasses wearer. You must have the opinions for all the glasses wearers here. Like, tell us what you think as a community. And it's just like, it's very easy to fall into that trap. And if you do acknowledge it, say, shit, I fell into this. I'm gonna correct myself, because that's the best way to move forward, is correct yourself. Or if somebody else calls you out or calls you in and corrects you, have some grace and move forward.
Yeah, and to your point, Sophie, to answer your question, that means everyone's responsible. No one person, no one identity, no one team or leader is specifically responsible. Everyone contributes in a very specific way. Yes, we're talking about recruitment, but there's an entire ecosystem that needs to be built after that, right? After someone comes on board to retain them. So everyone plays a part. I also do want to specify who we're talking about. Often you'll hear underrepresented minorities or BIPOC. I personally prefer to speak in terms of historically marginalized identities, because we are not the minority in a global aspect, and we are marginalized, not marginal people. The other thing is that BIPOC specifically is a huge umbrella. It stands for Black, Indigenous People of Color. That it includes many different communities, and not everyone addresses themselves as the same way. So I would say do what's appropriate for you, what's appropriate for the medium that you're using, and just be mindful of the terms that we're using specifically when it comes to recruitment, especially if we're getting into job descriptions and talking to recruiters. And when you're speaking to candidates, right, be very mindful of the language that you're using, in especially these terms.
And to bring back everything to DEBA, like that also may not include somebody who is disabled, whether it's a physical or mental or something else. It's not always inclusive of what the organization may be targeting in terms of diversity. And so to be mindful of that as well. So let's start. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'm going to jump in there too. I actually see a couple familiar names of people who support DEI, if not the DEI owner at their organization. And it's a huge misnomer if you are the person in charge of DEI, or DEBA, DEI, DEBA, JEDI, all interchangeable. They all work. We love them all. Because all of a sudden they're saying, okay, Sophie, you're in charge of DEI. You got to run everything. You got to own everything. You got to be the voice for everything. You got to figure it out. Go. And the reality is that person is oftentimes a project manager. They might have expertise. They might have an identity that they can leverage and use as support systems. But if they don't have that cross-functional buy-in, if DEBA is not owned by everybody in the organization, it will fail. Period. End of story. It needs buy-in across all functions. It needs buy-in across all levels. It needs budget. Ding, 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 ding. Give budget. If you have any initiative and you don't have budget, it's a failure. And that budget might be small, and that's okay, because it has to start somewhere. But make sure that you're not marginalizing and tokenizing, and it's not the same as a race or identity, but you're DEI person in your organization and expecting everything to be on their shoulders too.
Well, what I also want to say is budget may be something very sensitive right now, given the current climate. And so a lot of the points that we've actually put together that we'll be sending out after this, so the budget could also not just be monetary, but also be time-wise. Like budget time if you can't spend money right now. And again, we'll be sending out those resources. We'll be talking about some of them. But I do think like there are some great ways to do it financially that I highly encourage if organizations are able to do that right now. There are a lot of ways to incorporate everyone at the organization, especially if they're the interviewers or part of the interview process, which really come down to training internally, which don't always have to mean spending money, although it can. And there are ways to think about it, which includes everyone. Like I said, we'll be sending out some things about that later.
And especially if you need to save money as an organization, instead of doing a layoff, thinking about reskilling and shifting role responsibilities, even if temporary. Maybe there's an opportunity to have somebody reassigned to a DEI focused role or piece of their role for 6 months and take some actions and things that probably have been on a back burner and that you're now trying to move forward. So thinking about shifting responsibilities in these changing climates in recession or pre-recession or post-recession, whatever we're in as well.
Absolutely.
I would add, sorry, Sophie, I would add to that shifting those responsibilities and making sure that other people have buy-in is a great way to make sure you have a wide variety of perspectives in your DEI strategy. No one person should be informing or deciding on the DEI strategy, right? Like, leaders should not be having this discussion in a silo. Ask the people in your organization, because they will tell you what it feels like to be themselves day to day and will probably inform some of your initiatives.
Absolutely. And on that point, how do we feel like we can attract more underrepresented or like historically marginalized peoples to job postings?
So all the things we just talked about should be referenced and easy to find on your website. Are you doing DEI initiatives? Why or why not? What's going on? Are you taking action? Are you doing something as simple as saying, hey, we're allocating 5 hours a week toward this on a cross-functional thing, all the way to we're dedicating 5 million of this to a year. So sharing what's happening in your organization about your DEI work will allow folks to say, oh, well, I can see myself being a part of that. Because that's ultimately what you want in any candidate, an underrepresented, marginalized, anybody. You want to say, oh, they can see themselves here. They can see themselves working with this crew. I think on a really structural level, do a job posting audit. Where are you posting your jobs? Is it only on LinkedIn? Because I don't know about you, I work really hard to make sure my LinkedIn isn't homogenous, but as a white woman, my network is often white and often female. And so anytime I post a job, my guess is my network is going to be who apply are mostly white and mostly female. So when you think about your network, how are you diversifying your network and how are you getting that job posting to a more diversified place? LinkedIn, I love it. I will nerd out real hard about it. It is not the end all be all. A lot of you are here potentially because you have a connection with SingleSprout, work with recruitment agencies. Are they the one and only recruitment agency? No, but they might be able to hit a certain niche or a certain group or a certain demographic that you might not be able to get otherwise. But thinking about those kind of where are the jobs going. I actually, in this resource, I will link to a couple of different like free or very cheap places to post your job. Blackjobs.com. It's a real thing. When one of my recruiters once brought it up, I was like, that's not a real site, but it is. And you can post a job there. And so when you think about, hey, we know we have Black people are underrepresented in our workplace, we're going to post jobs where Black people go. Pretty basic. You go to the communities that exist and say, hey, we want you. We like you. I always encouraged my Black employees, and I said, if you feel comfortable, we want you to share these jobs because your communities are probably more homogeneously Black as well, because that's who we are. We are creatures of habit. We like what we like because that's the way bias works. So doing a job posting audit, seeing where you're posting, and again, not all of it means money. Some of it is just sharing in different places, making different connections, different networks. It's really important. Being mindful of the accessibility of the resources. So is it a job board where a candidate has to pay to access it? Or even I know some recruitment agencies, you have to be part of their inner circle before you can even get access to the job postings. That's not accessible for the average candidate. When you think about your job descriptions themselves, do they require excessive education? Do they still say you need to be able to lift 50 pounds because you're a role blank? I will tell you, never in my professional working at a desk, sitting in an office job have I had to lift 50 pounds. My laptop may feel like 50 pounds at times, but it's not actually 50 pounds. So when you think about what are your actual requirements, and I know Sophie feels very strongly about the education piece, Ayanna does as well. I detest having education in job descriptions. There are definitely times and a place where it's needed if there are certain advanced degrees that are needed. But when you think about education and what it contributes, oftentimes, if done well, it means there's cross-functionality, there's intersectionality. I myself, my background is theater, art, and Spanish. Like if you look at my educational background, there's no way I should be in HR or talking about DEI, but I can correlate everything I did in those degree programs to what I'm doing today, but they didn't make or break what I do today. And so really think critically about that education, and or in lieu of education, if you have experience in blank, or, we were talking about looking at candidates maybe from different industries. And for me, I love when we talk about teachers, and there's a whole teaching crisis, which is another whole 15 webinars on that side of things. But teachers make incredible hires, especially in startup land. They have to deal with 30 plus creatures that are all demanding of them, that are asking a million things. They have to be organized. They have to be resource driven. They have to be really tight with their resources so that they can be spread around among many people. So you think about those skills versus a degree, and all of a sudden your candidate pool is just going to explode. Ayanna, anything I missed in that?
Yeah, I'm going to plus and everything. I think, at the very beginning of your comments, you were talking about like display everything on your website, put your diversity stats out there. I want to acknowledge that can be scary, especially if you are not in the place that you want to be in this particular area. But I would urge you to lead into that and use that as a way to hold yourselves accountable, right? You're putting out this information to the public, and acknowledge that you are not where you want to be. You're going to make strides to be where you do want to be, and that it's going to take time, right? I think honesty and transparency is more of what candidates want to see, versus you just putting, like I said, that one person of color or that one disabled person on your website and making it seem like the entire organization is reflected in that particular image or number. The other thing I want to say is shout out to Leilani, who is in the audience, who is also one of our OPHR advisors, and actually put a lot of the resources that you'll get in the info sheet for Recruiting 101 in terms of like diversifying where you actually post. Hi, Leilani, where you post your jobs. A lot of this stuff does not necessarily have to cost you a lot of resources or money, right? It's a matter of, oh, there's a Hire Black Now Slack community. Can I enter and post jobs? Right? Like that is a very easy way to diversify where jobs are being posted, or where you're just networking with other people who are looking for these types of roles. So it's just a shift, like Jes said. And just be mindful again, where your resources and referrals are coming from often will reflect you. And so if that is not what you want, I would just be extra careful in heavily relying on those sources, right? It's okay to have referrals. It's okay to use LinkedIn, but just be mindful holistically where everything is coming from.
Yeah, and I'd love to touch on that, on a couple of points you both brought up. One is sharing what's happening in DEI can be scary. I would challenge the idea that any company is where they want to be. I think every company is constantly in progress. No company is perfect, and some companies work better for other people than others. So I think also no act is too small. It can be something like, hey, we looked over all the job postings and we made sure the language is okay. We decided to post jobs to like 3 different places. Things like that. Ted, I see your question. I'll be coming back to it later, because I also want to unpick what you mean there, but I see it. So I think that's just something worth noting, which is that it doesn't need to be these grandiose things. I think there's been a lot of emphasis on that. It comes back to the idea of you don't need a massive budget. You need a budget, but budget does not always mean monetary. It can, and that's great if you have the resources, but it can actually be a nuanced thing. And we've kind of touched on this, but are there other ways that you think companies can best communicate their DEI strategy?
Everywhere you interact with candidates. I mean, really just be upfront with it. We've talked a little bit about job posting, things like that, but job posting is like the first impression a candidate is going to get from you, right? So some of the things that I've really seen done beautifully is like EEO statements at the end of a job posting, right? Instead of like the typical like standardized template for EEO statements, how about you include that you acknowledge that historically marginalized identities may not always apply to jobs if they don't tick every single box, right? Or don't meet every requirement that you're looking for. You know, encourage them to apply even if they don't meet exactly what's said in there, because they may end up having those skills. It's just framed in a different way. And then meet them where they are, right? Ask them what's important to them. Is it opportunities? Is it, you know, advancement? Is it, you know, their recruitment feedback is just like, we want someone who's not racist in this interview process, right? Like, you don't know that unless you ask. Jess?
Yeah, the other thing is this is where you can really leverage your employee resource groups or affinity groups or business resource groups or DEI committees, whatever you call them, and say, what would you like candidates to know about what you do, about your contribution, about your impact? I always love a good old company blog and like have your ERGs contribute one blog post a month of like, hey, we did this initiative. It's Black History Month this month. What are you doing? Are you just saying like, hey, we did this one thing, or are you doing a lunch and learn and a poetry event and a live thing and a volunteer? Like, talk about what you're doing. You might only be able to do one thing. Also totally okay, but talk about it. What is the meaning behind it? Did you put your entire budget toward that one thing? And why was it so important that you put your entire budget toward that? So letting candidates know what's happening, what's going on in your real life, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. And we're definitely going to be talking next time more about how do you integrate all of this into an interview process to make it inclusive and to avoid tokenism and to make everyone have a similar equitable interview process. So I love all of these ideas. What happens if a company doesn't have a DEI recruitment strategy? We've talked a lot about like budgeting and like money and time and things like that. But what if you're starting from scratch?
So the one-pager document that is now a 6-pager document that you're all going to get access to, I promise it's not a scary 6 pages. It's a very easy to read, good 6 pages. We intentionally built it out with these different questions in mind and like 2 to 3 things you can do for each question. So if you don't have a strategy, don't necessarily put pressure on you to be like, we need to have a strategy tomorrow, but say, what can we actually take action on tomorrow? What are some small things? Maybe you don't put all of your job descriptions through a bias decoder. We offer 3 different options, 1 paid and 2 free. You can put all of your job descriptions through that tomorrow and edit those live. Ayanna mentioned an EEO statement. You can say, hey, actually, women will only apply to jobs if they meet 90% versus men will apply if they meet 30% of the boxes. We should acknowledge that and say, even if you don't think you're fit, please apply anyway. We want to know you. We want to meet you. So take some of these actions, and then you can start to categorize and say, okay, well, this took 5 hours a month, so we can keep maintaining that versus this was just like a one-off 1 hour. Does this go into different pillars? And I encourage you all to check out the 4 C's model, which is an ERG model, but can be used for DEI, thinking about commerce and culture and these different categories. And the most important of all is bring this to your leaders and say, okay, technology and product, what do you want to do in terms of DEI? Okay, marketing, what do you want to do in terms of DEI? Because the best way to get a strategy going with buy-in is involve all the departments and all the teams, and that is free. And that is a meeting you can have probably not tomorrow because everybody's calendars suck, but maybe in a week or 2. So you can get that process started and take baby steps. Pass it to you, Ayanna.
I do want to acknowledge that when we say strategy, it doesn't necessarily have to be something grandiose, right? I think about strategy as like intent into action. So break it down, right? Like, how do you align some of these things to your business goals and some of the things that you're already working on and weave it in with what's already going on? Don't make it feel like it's something else that you have to add on. Find what's going on, right? Like if the engineering team is working on a new app or a new website, how can we make it accessible? What other perspectives are we including in this decision-making process, right? Like add it into your project management that you're already doing. And then break it down into bite size, right? Engineering, you're responsible for this. HR team, we really want your opinion on this, right? And then find some of your communities. Find 1 or 2 communities that you really, really want to build meaningful relationships with and continue to invest in those, right? There's nothing worse than connecting with an organization that's working on placing marginalized people and then you end up leaving them and there's no follow through, right? Like make the connection, continue to grow it over time, and you will see your return on investment. And then don't be afraid to start somewhere. Like, it is okay if you figured out what's working for Airbnb or Canva or another organization and implement for yours. Like, no plagiarism here. Do it, right? Like, we're all figuring it out. DEI feels really new, but people have been doing it in just various capacities, and just continue beyond recruiting, right? It doesn't stop there.
I want to double down on what Ayanna said. Look at what other organizations are doing, what has worked, and grab it. There is no plagiarism of DEI ideas. Like, if something has worked successfully at another similar sized company, or you can take a piece of maybe a larger company's ideas, try it, test it out. That could be a great benchmark. Hey, they did this and it really worked for them. So what's our version of that? Maybe you're a 10th of the size. What's the 10th of the size scale of that? I dropped in the chat, Cultureamp just released one of their reports, and I absolutely love how they put it together. They talk about their demographics, they talk about their employee environmental social governance, ESG goals. They talk about how they tie it into business goals. It's really cohesive, it's really collaborative, it's really cross-functional. So you could just look at that, take an hour tomorrow, look at that and say, based on this, here are 3 things that we could do that are a piece of this, even if it's not the full thing. Do you even get employee demographics? Do you get recruitment candidate demographics? What can you do with those things that would make the process better for future candidates who might be in the minority of those applications in terms of demographics? And to Ayanna, on this point, ask the people who might be underrepresented in your workplace or marginalized in your workplace and say, hey, what do you wish you had here? What do you see? What are you missing? Is somebody racist? Can we do something about it? Beyond just a basic training. Unconscious bias training, while very good, is not enough, or it needs to be continual. You know, maybe you say, okay, we're going to do unconscious bias training, and every month we're going to choose a different demographic and talk about unconscious bias to that demographic. So you can do it all year long. That can be built out in-house. There's 3 jillion resources on Google. We can send out resources. You can ping us individually. Like, we're always happy to send out resources. Again, to Sophie's point, budget isn't always money. It oftentimes, and more importantly, oftentimes is time. Not more importantly, differently importantly, is time.
Very interesting answers. A few things that I want to pick out there is that intent into action. And also, Ayanna, what you were saying is it was almost like quite disjointed. You were talking about like involving that in product and like, how do you think about DEI involved in product? We ran a survey with like hundreds of candidates we placed over the past 5 years. Last year, the end of last year, we had quite a few candidates, right? Like, take the survey. Turns out about 46% of them did not identify as white. About 30% did not identify themselves as heterosexual. About 13% said that they were disabled. So there was a huge range of candidates we'd worked with without actually targeting those candidates, but by being thoughtful and having an approach, which meant that we were placing candidates that weren't historically in the tech field, which is really exciting. And that also goes back to hiring demographics of what does that look like. And to touch again on that point about integrating everything into your product as well as internally, 74% of the candidates accepted the offer because of the team or the culture. So if they see, and it all starts in the interview process, and it all starts with that initial reputation, like Ted said in the chat, like it all starts there. So if they see that and they see it's the right team and culture for them, it all trickles down.
Sophie, I wanted to touch on that and a little bit of what Ted said in a piece we missed. Something that's really actionable if you have an applicant tracking system, which my guess is most organizations over probably 50 people do, is you can send out templated emails. So if you have any interview prep, if you say, hey, these are the 15 questions that you might be asked, and here's different ways to answer them. Or, hey, here's what business casual means to us if we ask you to have a certain dress code. Or, hey, if your kid is in the background, totally okay. We get that kids are part of life and they're there. You know, so you can give them those contexts and those open clues, which also is a huge accessibility support for folks who maybe have ADHD and you having some prep, or, you know, captions on things, which I don't see captions on my end. I hope you all can see captions on your end, but, you know, captions should be a freaking default. Come on, Zoom, get your shit together. So thinking about ways you can prepare your candidates, also goes into reputation. I don't know if anybody here has heard of a little website called Glassdoor. That's a big thing on reputation. You can check out a lot. And I've written myself a couple of really negative Glassdoor reviews because at some point you have to. So candidates are out there, even if they don't get the job, they matter. Their opinion, their voice, their thoughts matter. Candidate surveys. Your applicant tracking system often will have post-interview candidate surveys. Ask what was going on. Ask questions that might be hard hitting, aka, did this live up to your expectations? Was somebody racist? Like, again, I'm not the wordsmith. You hire somebody from your writing team to do things. I say things bluntly, not always the best. But use and leverage systems that are already in place. One reason that a lot of folks like good recruitment agencies, such as SingleSprout, is they help them prepare. They have one-on-one touches, and a lot of, when a recruiter is getting 300 applicants, as most recruiters are getting for jobs these days, they can't do that one-on-one experience. So how do you scale it? You probably already have these documents built out somewhere. And I do want to give a shout out to one of the co-founders of SingleSprout, Natan, who I work with closely. I have never met somebody who embraced LinkedIn, social media, and at the intersection of DEI more than Natan. This dude gets his whole team rallied behind. You post so many, hey, here's an organization you should check out for this History Month. Here's someplace you should donate to. Here's a good cause. Like, I remember like a year and a half ago talking to Natan about how simple it was as long as you incorporate it in. If you tell your team who's doing social media, you can just share a resource. It doesn't always have to be self-serving. And check out LinkedIn. If you nerd out on LinkedIn, check out SingleSprout. Not an ad, but I always laugh every time I see you post something because I'm like, that's Natan's influence. But it just shows how simple but impactful it can be, especially when it's sharing, donating, join the voices of, listen to kind of posts.
It's interesting you bring that up. I've had candidates tell me that one of the reasons they joined SingleSprout was because of the social media, and they liked the groups that we donated to and advocated for, which was really interesting. We actually also did like we have a DEI committee here. And one of the big things we did last year was like host an event with G Code. So like having opportunities like that to volunteer and actually use our expertise is like also something that I think companies can think about, is like, how do you like take advantage of what you already know and do to give to others? One last question I have for both of you. A lot of the companies we work with are startups. They're moving quickly. They may have a DEI strategy, but maybe they don't. They're trying to grow fast. A lot of them are in San Francisco or New York, may not have the most diverse team to start with. Not that they don't care, but those like the space tends to be a little bit monolithic. A lot of the job descriptions, even if they don't say it, they are requiring startup experience or candidates not to be from large antiquated companies. We talked a little bit about that education piece. Sometimes candidates do need to have that CS degree for technical reasons, but sometimes they don't, and things can be picked up. How do you think companies should, and I mean this just for like the resume review section of it, how do you think they should screen candidates in a more inclusive way without going down that tokenism route and having like different tiers depending on how they perceive someone's background?
Yeah, I can definitely answer that one. Having come from a really large organization to a startup, one of the best advice I had gotten as a candidate is that just because I don't come from a startup environment doesn't mean I can't thrive in a startup environment. Startups want to scale, they want to grow. And you have the skills and the ability to understand what that means and what an organization looks like at X size. So I would encourage everyone to shift from startup experience to these skills you need to be able to thrive in this environment and push your organization further. That doesn't mean that everyone has access to startup environment, right? Like the networks are very limited and are in a very specific demographic. So that is also going to exclude your candidates. Look outside of that. Does this person have the ability to manage teams and be able to jump into multiple areas of expertise, which is probably what you need in a startup, right? If you only have 5 people doing all of the things. So shifting that mindset. Also, resumes don't look traditional these days, right? Like just because someone has one job listed does not necessarily mean that you understand that they have a podcast on the side or that they do speaking engagements on the side, right? Like they've got other things that they're refining skills, but not necessarily in a very clean cut job-oriented format. So good away from startup, right? Startup is just one type of environment and place where you can get experience. Like there are other places people can develop those skills. It's whether or not they can apply it to your environment that matters.
Yeah, thinking about the outcomes, what are the outcomes that you want this role to have? Have they had similar outcomes or have they had related outcomes? Again, I mentioned like school teachers, thinking about fields that have nothing to do with each other, and it may seem totally opposite, but like a school, and again, I'm stuck up in a school teacher, whatever, can get 30 kids to be quiet. Imagine what they can do in a meeting. Imagine how they can elicit responses when they call on people. Imagine when they color code those tabs in Google that have been needing to be color coded for 15 years. Like, I don't know. There's all of these little nuances that you often forget about. And I have almost exclusively been in startups, and it's super easy to put on that startup cap and then it falls over your eyes and you're blinded by all of the chaos you're in. And so thinking about the culture add versus the homogenous fit. Okay, if you get another person from a startup, they're probably in chaos land too, and they're coming from one chaos land to your chaos land. That doesn't give them time to breathe and sit and be. And so, to your point, there are certain requirements. Maybe you need that CS degree. Maybe they need to have blank type of experience. That's okay. They should have that. But make those like extreme must-have factors like 3 out of 10, and think about how those other 7 might play in different ways. You know, entrepreneurship, side hustles, you know, even being a stay-at-home parent or a caretaker. There's so much that goes into that. So what skills could apply to our workforce? And we're going to talk about it in one of the other future sessions, but think about how you're reframing your interview questions to get the answers you want. It's not about necessarily the candidate answering it correctly, but you need to get the answers you want, regardless if they're the right candidate. So how do you look at a resume with that same thing in mind of, is this person going to get the experience I need or the outcomes I need, even if it's not the exact line item? Because ultimately, a lot of candidates are copying a line item from your job description and putting it in the resume. That's not actually helpful for you as someone reviewing a resume. You want to actually know what's going on. You want to know the meat behind it. And what I always go back to is, I don't know about any of you on the call, but I know I am not a one-page kind of person. I am in my case now, 6 pages on this document, but I am not a one-page person. I don't know anybody in my life who is a one-page kind of person, but that's often 1 or 2 pages is what we're relegated to in a resume. So thinking also about what else are you looking out beyond their resume? Do they have a website? Are they nerding out on LinkedIn? Do they have a really great Twitter feed where they're talking about a whole bunch of other things? So trying to look a little bit more 360 at a candidate. What does their recruiter, account manager, whomever talk about? What about those references that people talk about on LinkedIn? Like, so thinking about a person more holistically. Again, I recognize there's a lot of blockers when you're getting 300 applications to one role, but start with the things you know you can filter out, and then really look at the rest and say, how is this person going to contribute and add, and how can I relate to their experience that's on this paper?
Fantastic. Thank you both so much for this. At this point, I'd love to open this up for any questions everyone may have.
Questions from a friend who works at a startup who needs support?
While folks are typing, I do want to address Ted's question about reputation. I think this is a really hard conversation for leaders to have, especially when they are hesitant on the reaction, of displaying different information. What I would say is that if it is truly aligned to your mission and your values, the people who will support you in acknowledging this information publicly is exactly who you want in your corner. Those who are resistant to it probably have some of their own work to do. So lean in on actually putting actions behind your strategy versus being scared for some of the flack that you're going to get.
I was actually just talking with a client today and talking with their VP of recruitment, and she's the executive sponsor for the DEI committee that I work with. And she was like, our COO or one of the C-suites was nervous about asking for demographic information, and we made it very inclusive. I'm not doing your standard EEO government stuff because I don't believe in that. And she was like, expressing concerns from this person that, are there legal implications of getting it and publishing it? And then what happens if they have a layoff? And then, they can actually find out, did they lay off maybe more Black women than anybody else? And then are they going to get potentially sued for that? And this is one of those areas where there's an element of you're screwed if you do and you're screwed if you don't. So you might as well do it and move forward and make progress. And in those cases, you can say, okay, well, we can look at the data and we can actually say, we documented all our performance reviews and all these Black women actually were doing horribly. And so they were the right people to let go. Sorry, Ayanna, you're on my screen right now. Versus, actually, this was just coincidental, or, oh shit, we actually did something wrong and there was bias. We can correct that. Publishing, I'm sorry, the small dog in the background. Publishing the data. Yes, it's scary, accountability, it's scary, but your people are going to be asking for certain things, especially in the DEI front. And the companies that are being progressive and forward thinking, they're going to ask, they're going to say, why don't we know the demographics of our internal companies? Let's not even talk about external. Why don't we know the internal things? And I said to this woman, if you're going to draw the line in the sand and say, we're not going to collect this data and here's why, you need to tell the entire company that, and you need to make sure that here's why is really good, because otherwise I, as the support person, and everybody else in that DEI committee is going to be like banging their head against the wall being like, why aren't we making progress? Why aren't we making progress? Why aren't we making progress? Because leadership hasn't drawn that line. And if you draw that line, if leadership says that, that is their decision. I am not involved in that C-suite. I would have words, but that's a separate thing. But you need to at least explain yourself and be clear so you can build that accountability and then say, what else can we do instead? If we can't get A, what is B? What is C? What else is on that DEI roadmap, that DEI strategy? So these conversations are happening at every organization. It may be hidden, it may be scary. I guarantee I talk to 3 or 4 different organizations a day. It is happening at every single one, whether 15 people or 1,500 people or 15,000 people every day.
Just to your point, Jes, I want to go back to the idea, though, that it's not always like the strategy can be really disjointed sometimes, and that's still okay. It can be like one person over here, one person over here, and they could not all come together with the same, like what seems like a goal, but the overall goal is having diversity, equity, inclusion, etc. within the organization. There is one question here. Are there any job boards you recommend to help us increase the reach of our available roles, specifically ones where candidates may not need to have special access, connections to, or pay for, as mentioned earlier?
Yes, in the resource that Sophie and Katie and team will send out, I'm going to link a couple of them. When you open those links, they are going to be overwhelming because there's like 400 entries on there. And what I would do is before you even open that link, say, we are specifically looking to target X, Y, and Z community. And not in a tokenistic way, but hey, we know that these groups are underrepresented and we would like to get more candidates from there. And then if we get more candidate opinions from there, so on and so forth. You don't have to try to get everybody all at once. You might try to focus on some intersectional ones, but have some pre-thought before you open up these tabs because there are a lot of resources. So it can be very overwhelming. I'm a woman of many tabs, so I try to be cautious when I encourage anybody else to open up a new one.
Yeah, I'd add on to that to know what diversity means for you in this particular conversation, right? If it's your engineering team where you need other people, like, know what that means for you, right? Like, diversity doesn't necessarily mean I need more people of color. You might have people of color in your organization. Maybe it specifically means we are lacking for women in leadership, right? Like, that is a very specific topic and something that you can make manageable. If you're talking about, I need all the brown people, well, that's probably not realistic, first of all, and probably not exactly what you need for your organization when you're looking at some of these communities, right? The communities are going to ask you, what are you looking for, right? Is it your engineering? Is it for support, right? Like the skills that you're looking for on particular teams, and then they will help you.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. So from what I hear you saying, it's like very much like, hey, this one team may need this thing, this other team may need things. I know at a previous organization I worked at, I remember saying, there aren't that many women. And my manager looked around and was like, there are tons of women. I was like, there are no women above me in this organization right now. So that there are some like below me technically in this hierarchy or at the same level, but it doesn't feel equitable. So like at that point, what does that look like and how does that feel? How are you targeting? An underrepresented group can be different depending on where you're looking and the perspective there and the group. And one other thing I would say about job postings is job postings are an amazing tool. And also I know I'm a little bit biased, but agencies are as well, of like, challenge your agency. What are they doing internally? You know, how do they think about it? Technically, we've spoken to lawyers on our end, like you're not supposed to, you know, like target groups. So we surveyed candidates, but we do not tag that on our end. So what are they doing? Have they spoken to people? Have they thought about this? Do they think about how to be inclusive and thoughtful with candidates? Same with disabilities. Like, if a candidate tells us this, we try and approach it thoughtfully. Things like that, to not just reach a further audience, but also when they come in, have a really good experience. Does anyone else have any other questions or just even thoughts that they'd like to add here? All right, then. Jes and Ayanna, do you have anything else you'd like to add as final thoughts?
DEI is a work in progress, and the key piece of that is progress. Take baby steps, keep making change. It takes time. You are not alone.
One last tip I would have is over communicate. Communicate as much as possible. That makes it a culture norm within your organizations and has everyone continuously thinking about it. And also will keep you honest and accountable for when times get rough and you may not be making as much progress as you want. So over communicate, obviously where appropriate, but continue to have the conversation.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much. This has been an insightful conversation. I know I have learned a lot. Ilani, I want to also read your one tip because I think it's useful as a final note. Find ways to measure what you're doing to keep leaders engaged. Leaders, especially in tech, love to see the numbers. And with that, thank you all so much and have a wonderful day.